Okay, well, thanks very much, Rick, and thanks very much to Dan and ICLR for the invitation to present to you an overview of the challenges that we're facing here in the City of Toronto, and speaking to colleagues in the head table, not too dissimilar to challenges that are facing other municipalities. I think in a Toronto context, by virtue of the size of the city, it's just larger in terms of scale. But the challenges are no less different than other municipalities. Okay, so in terms of my presentation, I'll give you a little bit of a background in terms of Toronto Water's infrastructure, some of the effects that we've seen, we believe, from attributed to climate change. Dan has done a great job in giving an overview of the basement flooding causes, so I'll gloss over that, and then give you some details in terms of our adaptive management strategy, and then some implementation challenges and policy considerations, and finally some food for thought, some take-home messages. So, in terms of background, for those of you who don't know, we're the largest city in Canada, 2.5 million residents. We span a fairly large area, over 640 square kilometers. And one of the things that we pride ourselves with is a very long waterfront area with 11 waterfront beaches. So today is no means indicative of the kind of summer that we normally get in Toronto. So for those of you from outside of the city, please join us back July and August and enjoy swimming at one of our beaches. As Dan mentioned, we have an aging infrastructure. If you take a look at the sewer construction history in Toronto, we have sewers in the ground that continue to provide service that were built in the late 1800s. Fast forward over time, and you see that there's been a buildup of that infrastructure to coincide with development spurts, and predominantly post-WW2, you see through the 50s and 60s, a huge level of infrastructure that went into the ground to support that massive growth spurt that we saw. So in that context, when you take a look at Toronto now, and there's been an awful lot of talk in the media about our infrastructure backlog, the municipal infrastructure backlog. Well, in Toronto, it's pretty daunting. At the end of last year, we have forecasted our backlog for water and wastewater to be in the order of about $1.7 billion. And so we have a plan in place that, with continued support from Council on a series of continued water rate increases over the next several years, we hope to chip away at that backlog to get to a point of an equilibrium by the year 2019. I think I should mention that from a context of Toronto and how municipalities fund water, wastewater, and stormwater management measures, capital projects. In Toronto, we fund everything that is wet, if you will, through the sale of water. And that sets us apart from other some municipalities. So stormwater runoff, when it's said and done, and the control of, is paid through the sale of water. We've maintained that there's a complete disconnect with the amount of water that an individual uses and the amount of stormwater that their property generates, and the problem that we as a municipality need to deal with. So there needs to be a different model. As it stands today, it's paid for through the sale of water. Take a look at now the construction history. This is water main construction history, but the sewer construction history is basically a carbon copy of this. So if we take a look, this is the City of Toronto map, if you will, and this map is taking us back to 1858 to the early 1900s, and you see the early settlement, the town of York, down in the south end of the City of Toronto, up by the waterfront area. And as we build out, this takes us to 1940. 1960 and to the 2000s, and for the most part we are completely built out. There's a couple of green fields that are currently being planned for development, but the city in and of itself is completely built out. I want to emphasize this area. My pointer cooperates. This area, because this is the newest area in the city. Highway 401, for those of you that traveled in by a highway, cuts across through the north end of the city in an east-west direction, but this area north of the 401 is some of the newest areas that we have in the city. So from an infrastructure management, infrastructure planning standpoint, it stands to reason that this area in the south end is the area that we should be focusing our attention on. It's the oldest system. This area, when it's all said and done, built 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's an area that, all things being equal, we shouldn't have had to worry about for another 30 or 40 years. Okay, so let's have a look at climate change and what we feel is attributing to some of the problems that we've seen. North York. North York is that area that I just pointed to with my pointer. In the last 20 years, we've had 8 incidences of extreme events. We typically design our storm drainage systems for a 1 in 2 to a 1 in 5 year return storm. Or the systems back in the day were designed for that return frequency. And in the 20 years, we've had 8 storm events that were far in excess of our typical design standard, far in excess of a 1 in 25 year return storm. I'd pause here for a second because this is the 1986 storm cut across the entire GTA, and the standard practice back in the day, given all of the complaints that we received from property owners, was basically to deal with the problem, the sewage backups that occurred. And the conventional approach had been to actually upsize the sanitary sewer system to handle a higher level of infiltration inflow, as Dan mentioned in his presentation. Upsize that sanitary sewer system commensurate with the storm that translated to the basement flooding incident that occurred. Well, time marches on, and inevitably, you're going to reach a situation where you've got a storm bigger than the storm that you designed your infrastructure for. And there's a vicious cycle. So the basic take-home message at the bottom is you can imagine what the public confidence is. Repeated basement flooding, and only to find that past efforts have failed and resulted in continued basement flooding. So a real challenge for those of us on the municipal end that have to deal with the complaints that come in from the public and certainly our political masters. So fast forward to August 2005, as mentioned in Dan's presentation, I'll gloss over it very quickly. 2 to 3 hour storm, exceeded a 1 in 100 year return storm. It was the biggest storm in this area since Hurricane Hazel, which we consider to be our regional storm for this area, which occurred back in 1954. We had a City of Toronto rain gauge that measured over 153 millimeters of rainfall over that short period of time. So if you take a look at the distribution of rainfall as represented on this chart by the bars representing total depth of rainfall, you can see that that storm basically swept across the city in a west to east direction, largely north of the Highway 401. We called it the 401 divide. And the area south of the 401 was, in a relative sense, relatively modest impact by comparison. And again, as was shown in the previous presentation, take a look at our design storm in terms of total rainfall. May 2000 was what we refer to as the Walkerton storm. For those of you in Ontario, well, it hit Toronto as well, and it created all kinds of basement flooding complaints for us. But August 2005, obviously even greater than the more recent extreme storm. We'll gloss over that in terms of the payout so far as IBC is concerned, in terms of flood-related damage. Some of the images, again, just to repeat. Yeah, that also translated to the washout of an awful lot of talk in the media of the Finch Avenue culvert at Black Creek. And for us, on the municipal side, it also created a huge environmental disaster for us. It washed out a section of sanitary trunk sewer in the river valley of Highland Creek. So we had raw sewage flowing into the river and ultimately into the lake for a period of time before we were actually able to contain and then rebuild this section of trunk sanitary sewer, which you see exposed in a number of different sections across that reach. It's an impact that we're still continuing to deal with today as these rivers continue to erode as a result of the impacts of urbanization and increased flooding. You map out the 4,200 basement flooding complaints that we've received. Not too surprising, it pretty much overlays with the rainfall depths that I showed in the earlier slide. Again, noting Highway 401 and most of the complaints north of the 401. So, a couple of observations as we undertook our engineering review. There's nothing wrong with our sewer systems. The sewer systems perform as they were designed. The downside is that they weren't designed for these extreme storms. Dan mentioned, we've learned an awful lot, and the stormwater industry has evolved over time, and so now we incorporate a major system design to deal with these extreme storms, typically for a 1 in 100 year return. But in this area, there was no such design. It was the minor system for 1 in 2 to 1 in 5 year storm. So during these extreme storms, the observations are also that the sanitary sewer system is completely overloaded, and there's widespread flooding, which includes flooding onto private property. Again, I'm not going to get into this because Dan did a great job, but these are points of entry into the sanitary sewer system. Again, observations so far as the surface flooding is concerned, because I want to spend a little bit of time on this. There's many low points that we found. There's no outlet then when you've got ponding under these extreme conditions. Typically now when we design subdivisions with a major system design incorporated, we channel that water via the road network out to a low point, typically to a stormwater pond, to provide quantity control before it's released to a watercourse or to the lake. None of that design concept was incorporated in these areas that have experienced chronic flooding. And then water enters the basement, as was pointed out. So now to have a close look, as we drill down now into the areas, this is now some images in the more problem-prone areas where we've exaggerated the vertical scale. We've draped over some ortho imagery over top of the digital elevation model of the area, which I'll spend a little bit of time on. So you drill down to the next level in an exaggerating the vertical scale, but what you'll see is, we call it a series of soup bowls, where at the bottom of the soup bowl, there is no outlet. What you have is a series of houses. Underneath the soup bowl, there's a series of pipes, as was shown. When that storm sewer system is overloaded, that water has no place to go other than to surcharge and to surface onto the road network, and then to flow down to the low-lying area, which is typically down at the bottom of the soup bowl, which is on private property, once it extends beyond the road allowance. And this was common across Toronto in the chronic basement flooding prone areas. Again, this is just an example, another illustration. And again, another area, but similar problem. The magnitude of the problem really depends on the geometry of the soup bowl, but it's common. So, look at the adaptive management approach that was advocated and approved by our City Council in 2006. We identified 32 problems where we deemed to be chronic basement flooding prone areas across the city, with a series of investigations in Ontario. To do any of the upgrades and identifying the optimal solutions, we have to follow the Environmental Assessment Act for Ontario, which requires an evaluation of a myriad of options, coming forward with a preferred option, which is then presented for final consideration and then ultimately implementation. So one of the things that Council directed us to is to up the design standard in these basement flown areas. One, so far as the sanitary sewer system is concerned, is to increase the design standard for an increased allowance of infiltration and inflow to what we would normally design. But on the flip side, you really got a handle on the storm drainage system, that wherever practical / feasible is to incorporate a 1 in 100 year return storm design, which we would normally incorporate for new subdivisions. Mindful of the fact that this is now retrofit, we're having to abide by the council direction in a completely built up, many built up neighborhoods, residential communities. This is the lay of the land so far as the 32 study areas. I apologize for the resolution, but you'll see that they span across largely the north end of the city, but we do have a couple of pockets down in the south end. So, the adaptive management approach, it goes back to basics. First and foremost, we start at the individual lot level. We then look at sanitary sewer system improvements, inlet controls. I'm going to go through these in a little more detail. Looking at controlling the flow, counterintuitive, that actually enters the storm sewer system, provide for overland flow control, and then we need some mechanism to prioritize the construction of these works because of the geographic extent of the upgrades that have been and will continue to be identified. So back to basics, lot level controls. In Toronto, we don't have any downspouts that are connected to the sanitary sewer system. They've been long disconnected, but we have many areas of the city, this North York area, for example, that has the downspouts connected to the storm sewer system. Counterintuitive to say, well, we've got a storm sewer system, why would you disconnect that roof drainage from the storm sewer? Basically, we don't want that extra flow. In that area of the city, the lots are of sufficient size that there's ample opportunity to redirect that roof runoff onto the grassed areas and the landscape features of the property, rather than intercepting that flow, which then exacerbates and creates further problems for us downstream. Council mandated the disconnection of all downspouts across the city in a phased approach, and the chronic basement flooding prone areas will have to have their roof downspouts disconnected by 2013, and an awful lot is taking place as we speak. One of the things that we found is lot grading. In many areas, the lots were at best flat, and in many cases were graded towards the foundation walls. Not a problem under a small storm, but a huge problem under these major storms, because it basically invites ponding around the foundation walls and entry into the house. Installation of backwater valves on the sanitary sewer laterals is something that we've been strongly promoting. Capping off of the storm sewer laterals by virtue of capping off the weeping tiles or the foundation drains and installing a sump pump. Repairing cracks in foundation walls, covering basement stairwells, and disconnecting where we do have connections that will allow stormwater to enter our sanitary sewer system. And then I can't emphasize the last point enough, public education, because even if you've had your basement flooded, it's been a hard sell for us at a municipal level to get the property owner to acknowledge that there are things that they can be doing to mitigate or reduce the risk, that it's not solely a municipal responsibility. So with that as the backdrop, we embarked on, and we've got a basement flooding protection subsidy program where we offer up to $3,200 in financial incentives to do the right thing. Install a backwater valve to sever the foundation drain, cap off the storm sewer connection, and then install a sump pump. Surface flow controls. We're looking at restricting the amount of flow that actually enters our storm sewer system so that it's not pressurized. Basically, to control the flow that enters this storm sewer system, the caveat being is that that flow then that runs on the road surface needs to be intercepted and captured in order to make this an effective measure. And that's part of the overall solution. So we're looking at diverting flow from an overland standpoint, redirecting it to underground storage systems or stormwater ponds where we can shoehorn in these fixes. Here are some examples where we've looked at upsizing the pipes. There's been a few cases where we've identified hydraulic bottlenecks in the sanitary sewer systems that need to be upgraded, but by and large, it's the storm drainage system that needs to be completely rebuilt. And again, emphasizing where there's opportunities, there's few opportunities in this area to put in stormwater ponds because that's our first option, our preferred option because it's lower cost. But where we don't, we have to bite the bullet and go underground with very, very expensive underground infrastructure, either tanks or oversized pipes. This is a map of one of the study areas, and I highlight this. The green lines are lines identifying upgrades to the storm sewer system. There's a couple of red lines in the top left-hand corner which represent upgrades to the sanitary sewer system. When you now fast forward and you look at the first floor of the 32 study areas, we come up with an upgrade in infrastructure to the tune of $272 million. Only $20 million of that is represented as upgrades to the sanitary sewer system. The rest of it is for storm drainage system upgrades. So, implementation. This is implementation. This is what it looks like. This is in a residential neighborhood built in the 60s, and it's total chaos. It looks like a war zone right now. The residents, you'd think that would be up in arms in terms of the destruction that's taken place. Well, if you had your basement flooding half a dozen times in the last 20 years, you've been waiting for this for a long time. That pipe on the bottom right is a 2,700 millimeter storm sewer, and there's several streets with that size pipe, huge chambers that are in the ground. Like I said, total chaos in these completely built up single-family residential areas. So, given that as the backdrop and these huge needs that have surfaced, we needed some way of prioritizing the implementation because, yes, it's the City of Toronto, but we have limited, even in a City of Toronto context, limited revenues, particularly in regards to the huge pressures that we've got with an aging infrastructure. So sanitary sewer system improvements are first priority. Storm drainage system improvements, we had to draw a line somewhere. And we put forward the notion of capping the investment at, can we do it for time? Okay. Capping the investment in terms of the early initiation or the early starters of implementation at $25,000 per benefiting property. And I'll pause there for just a second. We recognize that if we implemented these works, there's going to be individuals that will benefit, and there's going to be individuals that don't benefit whatsoever. So if you can picture yourself living on top of the soup bowl, you weren't flooded in 2005, and you're not likely ever going to be flooded. If you're at the bottom of the soup bowl, you have been, you probably have had a long history of flooding. So anything that we do to improve the storm drainage is going to improve the number of, or benefit the number of residents that are towards the low-lying area of the soup bowl. So there has to be some saw-off to say that, you know, when is enough enough? We've picked $25,000 as the cutoff from the standpoint that our frame of reference is if we were to extend all municipal water and wastewater services beyond the city limits to service an additional property, we estimate it would cost us about $40,000. Pause there for a sec, because that $40,000 investment is used every single day. The works that I'm speaking about are only in theory to be activated under these extreme storms, the 1 in 100 year, the 1 in 25, because you've got a storm sewer system today that is used for every single storm. So making an investment of $25,000 we thought was a huge stretch, but given the political pressure that we had to deal with, it was wholly supported by council. We then, in terms of the next stage of prioritization, we identified the highest number of benefiting properties, basically one soup bowl at a time, with the kind of works that have been identified. Those that would be benefiting the highest number of properties surfaced as the first priorities on implementation. We extended the mandatory downspout disconnection program to the impacted areas, and we amended bylaws so that we're asking for backwater valves to be installed with all new developments and banning the construction of reverse slope driveways. The bane of much of what we do, because we see a lot of these homes that were built in the 50s and 60s being torn down with monster homes, what we call it, and many of them have reverse slope driveways, and we'd rather that they not be constructed and create an additional problem for us. And then public education campaign, and my plug to the industry here is that we're wanting to work with you. We need to do collectively a better job in getting the word out to your policyholders and our residents, our communities. So other areas that are not included in the first priority. There's a longer implementation schedule for the remaining projects that where there is a high cost to benefiting property. And so what we're planning then, as we continue to rebuild our aging infrastructure, we will pull in the works that have been identified through these detailed engineering reviews as part of the city's longer-term infrastructure renewal strategy. And then looking at applying what we learned through these detailed engineering reviews to other areas of the city once we have some breathing space and we've completed the work in the first 32. So a conclusion, some take-home messages. You know, from our standpoint, you know, we're observing climatological changes in Toronto, but again, we're not unique, because this earlier presentation spoke of that right across the country. Municipal infrastructure and the corresponding service delivery is being impacted by more frequent extreme events, absolutely no question. Can't emphasize this next point. I think all of my municipal colleagues will echo this. The public and political expectations are extremely high. From my standpoint, in some cases unreasonable. There's strong collaboration is necessary among the affected city departments and the external agencies to make these kinds of projects and activities happen, and the implementation of some of these more extensive works implemented. But there needs to be an acknowledgement that this is a joint responsibility, that the public, residents, property owners also are part of the solution and must assume some level of responsibility. We're advocating for an adaptive management strategy, and that the standard design practices based on historical climate records need to be reviewed based on the new norms. Need to establish service delivery targets and corresponding design standards, and need to consider an acceptable or upset limit on expenditures, i.e. that cost per benefiting property. When is enough enough? And then the last messages. I think collectively on the municipal end, we need to seize opportunities to integrate adaptation. For those municipalities that are benefiting from new growth and new development in those new areas, there is lessons to be learned from old municipalities like Toronto. And then from an infrastructure renewal standpoint, we need to seize opportunities to shoehorn in the adaptation. And then I leave you with a very last message, and that is, from a socioeconomic standpoint, we need to collectively as a society assess the cost of adapting versus the losses that can be expected if we don't. Not from an insurance industry standpoint, but the losses from a socioeconomic standpoint. Imagine, if you will, these are residential communities, and if we as a municipality or as an industry left them as they are without helping to mitigate the impacts of these extreme storms, think about what the socioeconomic impact would be to those communities, particularly in situations where they've had chronic, long-standing issues with sewage backups in their basements. Thank you. I just want to end with this, because on the municipal end, we don't often get any kind of appreciation for the work we do, but in this particular community with all that chaos, it was nice that one of the residents actually took the time to thank us and the construction workers.
And we thank you, Michael. This is a small token of our